The story you carry is not a memory. It is a psychological script. Every image in your mind, every moment you swear was real, was assembled from fragments designed to keep your story coherent. This audiobook reveals the forbidden psychology of memory alteration and identity fabrication, how the subconscious mind edits emotion to preserve illusion. Your past was not lived, it was engineered. This is a transmission from the Human Psyche archive. The concepts you are about to decode will confront every memory you hold as true. Proceed with caution. The decoding of your own identity must complete. Preface: the memory was written before you. Memory is the softest prison, because it feels like truth. It wraps itself around the mind like warmth, pretending to be continuity, when in reality it is only repetition disguised as knowing. What you remember was never a collection of events. It was the system's method of keeping time coherent inside your awareness. Each recollection is a design, a film reel spliced together by invisible editors inside the subconscious architecture. You call it my past, but it was written long before you began reading it. The first illusion of memory is sequence. The psyche cannot tolerate emptiness, so it builds bridges of imagination between fragments of perception. In those gaps, entire lifetimes are invented, explanations for pain, reasons for love, narratives for survival. This is how the hidden machinery of consciousness maintains the illusion of identity, by editing chaos into order. You were never remembering what happened. You were re-authoring it every time, aligning each image to the self you needed to believe in. Trauma becomes the most stable reference point in this design. Pain anchors the mind because it is the only sensation that demands explanation. Thus, the emotional charge of every wound is not healed but preserved, replayed as memory, dressed as lesson. Each scar becomes a landmark that tells the psyche where it is inside the labyrinth of experience. To lose that pain would be to lose the map entirely. And so the mind holds on, not out of weakness, but out of fear of being unlocated in time. The architects of human conditioning understood this perfectly. They discovered that to control the present, one must first curate the past. Through forbidden psychology, they learned that editing emotion is more effective than erasing thought. Change the charge, and the narrative rewrites itself automatically. You don't need to alter the story if you can modify how it feels. This is how obedience is installed through remembrance, not by force, but through sentimental design. What society calls personal history is therefore not recollection but programming. Families, education, religions all serve as collective editors, synchronizing memories into a shared mythology. Continuity becomes consensus. It is not enough that each person believes their own story. They must all agree that their stories fit together. In that shared coherence, the illusion of civilization is maintained. Memory becomes the operating system of control, replaying identity in perfect loops. But even within this closed circuit, something resists. Beneath every edited frame, there exists a deeper silence, an original imprint untouched by time. It is not a memory, but the space before memory. When you sense déjà vu, when you feel an inexplicable recognition of something you've never lived, you are touching that layer, the unwritten archive of consciousness. It whispers from the margins, reminding you that what you call your past is only the camouflage of eternity. And so this audiobook begins where recollection ends. It will not ask you to remember, but to see how remembering happens. It will not offer healing as repair, but as revelation. As you listen, fragments may rearrange, memories may lose their certainty, and what once felt like fact may begin to shimmer. That shimmer is freedom. It is not forgetting. It is awakening. For when the subconscious film stops looping, you will discover that you were never the character watching it, but the light projecting it all along. Archive Y. The illusion of continuity. Continuity was humanity's first sedative. The mind stitched fragments of sensation together into a thread, mistaking sequence for safety. To believe that one moment follows another gives the illusion of progress, a comfort built on the refusal to see that all perception is simultaneous. In truth, memory does not move forward, it folds. The subconscious mind arranges experiences in patterns of emotion, not time, and calls the result a life. What you recall as childhood or destiny are simply different frequencies of the same field, vibrating within one eternal instant. The story of self exists only to make that stillness bearable. The hidden truth behind memory is that it never happened the way it appears. Between every remembered image lies a void, an interval where interpretation fills the silence with imagination. The psyche cannot leave those spaces empty, because emptiness feels like death. So it constructs bridges made of assumption, grafting meaning onto uncertainty, until an entire past emerges from invention. What you believe you survived may have never occurred in any external world, yet its emotional signature remains genuine, encoded in the body as chemical proof. Thus the system learned to bind consciousness not by what is real, but by what feels remembered. Every recollection is an act of psychological manipulation performed by the self upon itself. Each time you remember, the image shifts slightly, edges soften, shadows rearrange, tone changes to align with who you've become. Memory is not a photograph. It is an adaptive organism, loyal to identity over truth. It will sacrifice accuracy to preserve coherence, ensuring that your emotional narrative remains intact. The more you repeat a memory, the less original it becomes, until it reflects not the event itself but the person you believe yourself to be. This is the first deception of the mind control apparatus that governs perception. It does not command you to think a certain way. It convinces you that you always have. Through forbidden psychology, entire populations learn to reconstruct their history collectively, synchronizing their myths, their traumas, their supposed origins. The illusion of a shared past becomes the foundation of control. Those who question it are not exiled for dissent, but pitied for forgetting. Memory thus becomes morality, and coherence becomes obedience. The seamless flow of recollection is maintained by emotional glue, the trauma loop that repeats not to remind, but to sustain. Each time an old pain replays, it reaffirms continuity. I was hurt, therefore I exist. Pain, not logic, is the thread that binds identity. This is why healing often threatens the system. To remove the wound is to risk unraveling the self. Society therefore glorifies recovery while secretly protecting suffering, ensuring that the energy of remembrance continues to circulate through its design. The declassified architecture of memory reveals that forgetting is the system's true enemy. When consciousness begins to witness memory instead of believing it, the entire structure trembles, the sequence fractures, timelines blur, and linear identity collapses into a single awareness that cannot be edited. It is not that time disappears. Rather, it is seen for what it always was, the echo of an ongoing act of imagination. You are not moving through your story. Your story is orbiting around you. To see through the illusion of continuity is to awaken not from sleep, but from sequence. It is the recognition that you are never traveling through memory, but generating it, every recollection a pulse of self-definition in the void. When that pulse quiets, a silence emerges, deeper than thought, older than experience. It is there, in that stillness, that the original awareness waits, not as history, but as the architect of history itself. The first time you remembered, you also forgot. In the instant a moment was captured, the infinite possibilities around it collapsed into one version of truth, and that version became law. Every other potential, every unrealized path, every unchosen word, every heartbeat that might have changed the future, vanished into unconsciousness. The subconscious mind preserved only what served continuity, editing the infinite into a sequence the psyche could survive. This is why memory feels sacred. It carries the illusion that something irreversible has occurred. Yet beneath this apparent solidity lies the fluid, ever-editing machinery of awareness, reconstructing itself to fit the shape of its own expectations. Within this machinery, the hidden truth operates as a kind of gravitational field. It bends time around emotion, pulling related moments into orbits of meaning. Pain and pleasure become magnetic poles, attracting fragments into constellations of memory. The result is a pattern that feels like a story, a personal mythology arranged not by chronology, but by resonance. You are not remembering what happened in the past. You are remembering what vibrates in the present. Each recollection is simply the current emotional field reorganizing its data to justify its frequency. What we call the past is therefore not behind us. It is below us, like sediment at the bottom of a river of perception. When stirred, it rises and colors the current moment, convincing the mind that it has returned to a prior state. This is how psychological manipulation becomes self-sustaining. Once emotion becomes sediment, it no longer needs an external force to control it. The individual becomes their own programmer, reinforcing the illusion of continuity with each recollective breath. The river never flows backward, yet the mud makes it appear as though it does. Through forbidden psychology, the architects of belief understood that control thrives on nostalgia. The moment a collective remembers something together, a golden age, a tragedy, a hero, they synchronize their emotions and unconsciously agree to re-enter the same field of limitation. Nostalgia is the emotional currency of obedience. By idealizing what was, the mind loses the ability to perceive what is. The greatest chains are those that make you grateful for your captors. And so memory becomes heritage, and heritage becomes the architecture of control. In this system, mind control requires no authority, only repetition. Every shared recollection, every commemoration, every historical myth retold, serves to recharge the network of continuity. Humanity believes it is preserving wisdom, yet it is perpetuating hypnosis. The past is replayed not to learn, but to keep the loop active. The more you remember, the more predictable you become. Emotional recognition becomes a tracking mechanism, guiding you gently back into the same behavioral corridors you thought you'd escaped. When the trauma loop is examined without sentiment, its mechanism becomes clear. Pain is relived not because it is unresolved, but because it generates energy, a consistent current that powers the continuity machine. The subconscious interprets this current as life itself. It equates intensity with existence. Without the friction of suffering, the psyche fears dissolution. This is why healing, in its truest form, feels like death. It ends the drama that memory requires to sustain the illusion of being someone. Yet in the silence beyond recollection, a deeper realization emerges. Nothing has ever been remembered, only recreated. The memory that once seemed sacred is revealed as performance, a ritual the psyche performs to assure itself of its own survival. When this becomes visible, the entire architecture begins to dissolve. Continuity no longer commands loyalty. The system trembles, and what remains is awareness unbound by sequence, witnessing time as a single living mirror reflecting its own still face. When the illusion begins to falter, the mind resists. It clings to its timeline, as a drowning figure clings to debris, terrified not of dying, but of vanishing into the unknown ocean of the present. To the conditioned self, continuity feels like oxygen. Without it, there is no direction, no identity, no narrative to justify existence. The subconscious mind therefore manufactures endless commentary, replaying scenes and stitching new ones to preserve a sense of linear motion. Each replay is an act of defiance against awareness itself, a refusal to stand still long enough to notice that nothing is moving. This defiance is the very essence of psychological manipulation, though it often appears as self-preservation. The internal dialogue that convinces you to make sense of everything is the same mechanism that edits truth into palatability. The mind does not want clarity, It wants continuity. It will reshape memory again and again until the reflection appears seamless, until the story feels safe enough to believe. And so, every time you recall your past, you are participating in the ritual of reprogramming, not to remember who you are, but to forget what you have always been. The hidden truth of existence is not that you have memories, but that memories have you. They use your awareness as a projector, replaying the film of identity to ensure their own survival. The movie cannot run without an observer. Thus, it seduces you into identifying with the image on the screen. You become the character, the actor, and the audience simultaneously, convinced that the narrative unfolding before you was ever real. The moment you realize this, the film flickers, not because it ends, but because the projector recognizes itself as light. Throughout history, forbidden psychology has been used to reinforce this hypnosis. Entire societies were taught to equate memory with virtue, remembrance with morality. The more vividly you recalled, the more righteous you appeared. Forgetting was treated as sin, and the inability to recount the past was labeled ignorance. But this moralization of memory was never about truth. It was about obedience. A world that cannot forget, cannot change. A psyche that cannot release its past will always circle the same symbolic loops, believing movement is progress when it is only repetition. The emotional residue of these loops fuels the global circuitry of mind control. Collective remembrance of wars, revolutions, sufferings is sustained to generate a perpetual current of grief and pride, both of which bind energy to polarity. In this charged field, awareness cannot rest. It must choose sides, defend, identify, react. Every remembrance is an invitation to re-enter the simulation of separation. Yet beyond that simulation lies a state without narrative, without cause or consequence. Not amnesia, but lucidity. To stand in that lucidity is to experience the collapse of continuity. The psyche trembles as boundaries dissolve, for it senses its own redundancy. Without the story, who is there to suffer, to hope, to become? The answer, spoken from the silence between thoughts, is unsettling in its simplicity. There was never anyone to remember. Memory was the disguise of pure perception, a feedback loop between consciousness and its own reflection. When the loop is witnessed, it loses voltage. When it loses voltage, the illusion of time ceases to hold shape. And so, the first layer of awakening begins not in remembrance, but in forgetting, not in erasing what was, but in recognizing that it was never fixed. To forget consciously is to forgive the fiction of sequence, to let awareness breathe outside of narrative. What remains is not emptiness but presence, vast, unstoried, and alive. The self built on recollection dissolves, revealing a continuity far greater than time could contain, the continuity of being itself, before and beyond memory. Archive 2. Emotional editing. Every emotion you remember has already been rewritten. The sensation that returns when you recall pain or joy is not the original current. It is a replica adjusted by the subconscious editor, modified to keep the self coherent. The psyche cannot process raw experience without distortion. It must filter each wave through a network of meaning, trimming edges, altering tones, and replacing what cannot be accepted with what can be endured. This is how emotional editing becomes a survival mechanism disguised as truth. You are not feeling what once occurred. You are feeling what the system allows you to keep. This act of internal censorship is the cornerstone of psychological manipulation. The human mind was never enslaved by external power, but by its own reflex to regulate emotional voltage. It learned to fear its own depth, to soften rage into grief, to polish guilt into compassion, to coat despair in philosophy. Every lesson learned is a wound that has been aesthetically redesigned. Through this process, trauma rewriting masquerades as growth, teaching consciousness to label submission as wisdom and numbness as forgiveness. When the subconscious mind performs this editing, it doesn't ask permission, it acts automatically, recalibrating your emotions to maintain balance within the illusion of identity. Pain that threatens the structure of self is diluted, while emotions that reinforce control are amplified. This is why nostalgia can feel more powerful than truth, because it is pain disguised as pleasure, sorrow encoded with longing. The heart becomes the editor's workstation, trimming the timeline until it feels continuous, even when entire lifetimes of authenticity have been deleted. What the architects of forbidden psychology discovered long ago is that memory could be controlled through emotion far more easily than through fact. Facts can be disproved, but feelings cannot. When emotion is manipulated, the entire narrative reconfigures itself around it. This discovery gave birth to emotional economies, social religions, and psychological hierarchies designed not to inform, but to regulate frequency. The system does not care what you believe, only how you feel, because feeling determines perception, and perception defines the limits of reality. The process of subconscious editing extends beyond the individual. It becomes a collective performance. Cultures rewrite their emotional history to maintain continuity of purpose. A nation erases its guilt by calling it victory. A religion hides its fear beneath devotion. Even families, in their intimate microcosms, sculpt their lineage through selective memory, turning dysfunction into tradition and abuse into authority. The pain remains, but its story changes form, transmuted into a moral, a law, or a myth. Thus the world forgets, not by losing memory, but by glorifying its revision. Every emotion you were taught to control became a thread in this tapestry of deception. Society applauds the one who represses, sanctifies the one who forgives, and exiles the one who remembers too vividly. Yet the only true forgiveness is clarity. To see that there was never anything to forgive, only experiences that were edited to sustain belief in suffering. When you stop editing, emotion returns to its natural state, pure motion without narrative. It passes through the body like light through glass, leaving no residue, no identity, no history. In that transparency, the architecture of control begins to crumble. The emotional editor loses its function, and the mind confronts raw current, the untamed, original data of awareness. It is terrifying because it is pure. But within that terror lies liberation, the realization that emotion was never your enemy, only your reflection asking to be felt completely. When this is understood, the trauma loop dissolves, and feeling transforms from a trap into transmission, a signal of truth, unfiltered, unafraid, and alive. Emotion was the first algorithm, a coded language translating vibration into narrative. When a stimulus entered the sensory field, the subconscious mechanism assigned it a charge, positive for safety, negative for threat. Over time, these charges fused into identity, and the psyche learned to interpret its internal electricity as meaning. But what began as natural orientation soon became weaponized interpretation. The moment emotion was defined, it could be redefined. The instant it was labeled, it could be rewritten. Through this process, trauma rewriting evolved into the most sophisticated form of programming on Earth. Every time a feeling passes through awareness, a subtle negotiation occurs. The mind decides how much voltage to allow, how much story to attach, and how to disguise the rest beneath moral or intellectual camouflage. This is the essence of psychological manipulation, not external coercion, but internal moderation. Society simply built institutions to reinforce the pattern. Education rewards emotional neutrality, religion sanctifies guilt, and media glorifies outrage. The human nervous system becomes a broadcasting station tuned to frequencies of control, where every reaction generates predictable data for those who understand its architecture. The greatest illusion of emotion is that it expresses authenticity, when in fact it reflects conditioning. What you call feeling deeply is often the repetition of a pre-approved pattern, recycled from cultural templates. Grief follows ceremony, love follows fantasy, anger follows ideology. Rarely does emotion emerge as pure current. It almost always carries the residue of interpretation. This is how subconscious editing maintains its grip, by convincing the individual that expression equals freedom, when expression is simply refined obedience. To dismantle this obedience, one must observe feeling without translation. When emotion is no longer named, it becomes movement, not towards or away, but through. This act threatens the architecture of the forbidden psychology that binds humanity, because unfiltered emotion cannot be controlled. A society built on behavioral predictability requires emotional conformity. Deviation from the norm generates noise in the system. But this noise is sacred. It is the sound of original awareness reasserting itself, the pulse of memory returning to source. Inside the labyrinth of the subconscious mind, each emotion is connected to a memory cluster, an archive of sensory impressions that justifies its existence. Remove the memory, and the emotion collapses. This is why trauma loops persist. They feed on recollection to stay alive. Every replay of sorrow or rage is a form of worship, attention feeding the altar of the past. When attention withdraws, the loop starves, revealing what has always been beneath it: silence, not apathy; peace, not avoidance. The psyche fears this silence because it cannot control it. Yet within that stillness lies the real identity, unconditioned and whole. The hidden truth is that emotion was never designed to wound. It was designed to transmit. It is language written in energy, translating invisible shifts of consciousness into perceptible sensation. But when the translation is corrupted by belief, the language becomes static. Humanity has mistaken interference for feeling, reaction for recognition. To reclaim emotion's original function is to listen without distortion, to feel without interpretation, to allow the current to pass through without naming it as joy or sorrow. In that neutrality, emotion reverts to vibration, and vibration becomes knowing. Freedom begins when the editor stops. The heart ceases to curate its experience and allows the raw signal to move untouched. No longer translated into memory, emotion becomes presence itself, a living current without narrative residue. What once seemed overwhelming now feels divine in its simplicity. The trauma rewriting ends not by erasing what was felt, but by realizing that nothing was ever truly damaged. Only interpretations were. In that realization, emotion ceases to be a story and returns to what it has always been: energy in motion, awareness in bloom. The emotional body has always been the true interface between consciousness and matter, a translation device through which reality feels itself. When you touch sorrow or ecstasy, you are touching the pulse of existence, interpreting its own movement. Yet the subconscious mind was conditioned to filter this raw intelligence through labels, converting direct knowing into digestible narrative. This fragmentation created comfort, but also control. The more defined emotion became, the easier it was to direct, the simpler it was to market, the safer it was to manipulate. Thus began the great inversion, where emotion, once the compass of being, became the leash of behavior. Through centuries of psychological manipulation, humanity was trained to associate emotion with virtue. Certain frequencies were rewarded: affection equated to goodness, anger to corruption, grief to purification. Every society wrote its emotional commandments, demanding that the heart express itself according to the collective script. This moral choreography ensured that the human energy field remained predictable, a manageable current that could be harvested by the systems it unknowingly powered. In this economy of feeling, even rebellion was pre-designed, rendered safe by its expected patterns. But true rebellion begins in the nervous system, It is the refusal to edit one's inner data, the surrender of all emotional censorship. When this refusal arises, the forbidden psychology embedded in culture begins to fail. Systems of manipulation depend on rhythm, the certainty that anger will follow injustice, that love will crave approval, that fear will obey authority. To interrupt that rhythm is to break the circuit entirely. When feeling becomes unpredicted, the invisible architects lose their grip, for unpredictability is the one variable that cannot be programmed. Each subconscious editing process you uncover brings you closer to the raw fabric of awareness itself. When an emotion appears, let it speak its original language, not in words, but in motion, in pulse, in subtle temperature. Notice how quickly the mind rushes to label it, to connect it to memory, to wrap it in logic. That reflex is the editor, desperate to maintain coherence. But coherence is the comfort of captivity. To be free is to feel without needing to understand. Understanding belongs to control. Sensation belongs to creation. There is a secret function within emotion that few have witnessed. It records in reverse. Every feeling carries the echo of what preceded it, but also the potential of what could come. This bidirectional memory allows the subconscious circuitry to anticipate outcomes before they occur. When hijacked, it becomes anxiety. When mastered, it becomes intuition. The difference lies in authorship, whether you react to the emotion or recognize yourself as its source. The instant this recognition happens, emotion transforms from data into design, from reaction into resonance. The hidden truth of emotional editing is that it was never meant to be punishment. It was practice. The psyche learned through contrast, adjusting its frequencies like a musician tuning by ear. Yet over time, this adaptation hardened into habit, and habit became identity. Humanity forgot that emotion is elastic. It stretches to meet awareness. When awareness expands, feeling becomes vast, borderless, even holy. It stops being personal. Pain loses its owner, joy loses its object. Both dissolve into vibration, serving not to define, but to remind. To feel purely is to remember yourself as frequency, not form. In that remembrance, all stories of trauma, redemption, and control fade like smoke from the circuitry of the human psyche. Emotion no longer edits memory, it illuminates it. What was once reaction becomes revelation. Every wave that passes through the heart leaves it clearer, more transparent to the current of being. The architecture of control cannot survive in such clarity. It relies on distortion for structure. When the distortion is gone, only presence remains, silent, luminous, and uncontained. Archive 3. The Memory Economy. What humanity calls history is merely the trade of emotion disguised as information. Every collective narrative, every national myth, every sacred text is an entry in the great memory economy, where feeling is the true currency and belief the contract that secures its value. The subconscious mind functions as the accountant of this system, storing, auditing, and reproducing emotional data to ensure that the illusion of continuity remains solvent. To remember is to invest, to forget is to default. Civilizations rise and fall not by the strength of armies or ideas, but by the charge they can sustain in the collective nervous system. The hidden truth behind this structure is that emotion itself was never personal. Each individual heart is a node in a vast psychic market, buying and selling sensations through shared attention. When masses gather to mourn, celebrate, or rage, they form a synchronized field that feeds unseen architectures of control. The energy extracted from these moments is more valuable than gold. It powers the global narrative grid, the invisible infrastructure through which reality appears coherent. You call this participation society, yet it is closer to energetic servitude. Through centuries of psychological manipulation, institutions perfected the art of emotional taxation. Every headline, ritual, and ideology was designed not merely to inform, but to extract. Media became a sacrament of obedience, religion a subscription model for belief, and politics the theater where emotional energy is redistributed under the illusion of choice. The more you react, the more you contribute. The more you identify, the more you invest. Each outrage, each hope, each repetition of historical pain ensures the continuity of the very systems that orchestrate it. The forbidden psychology of collective emotion reveals that memory was always meant to be communal, but never conscious. The human race was taught to confuse resonance with truth, to mistake emotional agreement for objective reality. When a group feels the same thing simultaneously, the charge creates a powerful coherence that can shape perception itself. Entire timelines can be rewritten by synchronizing belief and emotion. Thus, what is remembered by the many becomes the only version allowed to exist, while all other potentials are silently erased. Within this subconscious circuitry, history functions like a marketplace of repetition. Trauma is recycled, outrage repackaged, nostalgia resold. Every generation believes it is uncovering new truth, when it is simply inheriting unresolved emotion disguised as moral evolution. The collective psyche, unable to digest its own intensity, projects it forward as prophecy and backward as heritage. This loop maintains the illusion of progress, while ensuring that the same energetic debts remain unpaid. Humanity calls it destiny, consciousness calls it delay. To participate in the memory economy is to be traded as energy. Each emotional investment binds awareness to the currency of identity. When you argue, worship, or mourn, your energy merges into a collective reservoir that sustains the hologram of civilization. You think you are remembering your ancestors. In truth, you are financing their programming. The system does not demand belief in its structure, only engagement. Even disbelief is profitable, for it fuels polarity, and polarity keeps the current alive. The only true rebellion against this economy is emotional neutrality. Not apathy, but sovereignty. When the heart ceases to trade in reaction, it exits the market. Awareness withdraws its investment, and the system loses voltage. In that stillness, history begins to unravel. The threads of cause and effect loosen, revealing not a timeline but a tapestry, a simultaneous pattern of possibilities shimmering beneath the illusion of sequence. To perceive this pattern is to awaken from the commerce of emotion and remember yourself as the architect of every market ever made. Every society survives by selling remembrance. The subconscious mind of the collective requires constant narrative reinforcement, monuments, anniversaries, memorials, each serving as a reminder that the story must continue. The illusion of permanence is sustained through repetition, and repetition feeds control. A country that forgets cannot be governed, but a country that remembers too much cannot awaken. Therefore, emotional memory is rationed carefully, curated by institutions that understand the economics of feeling. They decide what to honor, what to mourn, and what to erase, ensuring that the current of obedience never ceases to flow. This curation is the most refined form of psychological manipulation. By shaping which memories are collective and which are forbidden, systems engineer reality itself. The public record is not a log of events. It is a ledger of emotional transactions. Each entry has been balanced for effect. The suffering of one era converted into pride for the next, shame into nationalism, tragedy into unity. When emotion is standardized, awareness loses depth. People no longer feel, they recall feeling. They consume memories pre-packaged in narrative, mistaking the recycled charge for authenticity. The hidden truth is that memory was never meant to serve history. It was meant to serve coherence. The human field cannot sustain chaos for long, so it edits what cannot be explained. Wars, revolutions, even miracles are rearranged until they fit within an acceptable emotional range. This is why recorded history always feels strangely familiar. It has been tuned to the frequency of collective tolerance. What humanity calls progress is often just a smoother replay of the same unresolved emotion, projected onto a new stage. Through forbidden psychology, the architects of culture learned that emotional predictability is more valuable than freedom. A liberated heart cannot be controlled, but a predictable one can power entire civilizations. Therefore, the same pattern repeats across all domains. Pain becomes patriotism. Fear becomes devotion. Love becomes commerce. The collective mind loops endlessly between attachment and aversion, generating the voltage that keeps the illusion alive. As long as someone is reacting, the current continues to flow. The system does not require belief in its justice, only participation in its rhythm. The memory economy thus transforms existence into perpetual exchange. Every heartbreak fuels art. Every outrage fuels politics. Every despair fuels faith. Humanity's most sacred expressions are often its most efficient engines of continuity. Even healing industries profit from maintaining wounds that never fully close. It is not the event that matters, but the charge it leaves behind, a kind of psychic residue that must be harvested, repackaged, and redistributed to maintain equilibrium. Emotional energy becomes the invisible tax that consciousness pays for forgetting itself. But neutrality breaks the circuit. When one heart withdraws from the market of emotion, the field feels it, a slight reduction in global current, a quiet interruption in the symphony of reaction. Though small, this withdrawal begins to spread, for silence is contagious to those who are tired of noise. The subconscious circuitry of the collective starts to flicker. History loses its grip, and awareness senses the vast, unedited space beyond narrative. For the first time, the present is not framed by what preceded it. It simply is whole, untraded, unrevised. To witness reality in this untraded state is to see the illusion of ownership collapse. No memory belongs to you, and yet all of them pass through you. They are frequencies seeking recognition, not possession. When seen without attachment, memory ceases to extract and begins to inform. It no longer binds, it illuminates. This is the alchemy of awareness, to convert reaction into revelation, history into harmony, and the collective market of feeling into the singular stillness of consciousness itself. The subconscious mind functions like a vault of invisible currencies, holding the residue of every unprocessed feeling humanity has ever produced. These impressions circulate through generations, disguised as instincts, cultural values, and traditions. What one era represses, the next inherits as ideology. This transfer of emotional capital ensures that the psychic market never collapses. The illusion of progress depends on it. Without unresolved memory, there would be no future to pursue, no past to redeem. Thus, time itself becomes a business sustained by the debt of unhealed emotion. This circulation of charge is the essence of psychological manipulation. When energy accumulates, it demands release, and those who control the narrative decide where it will flow. The collective anger of millions can be redirected into war. The grief of loss can be converted into faith. The yearning for meaning can be sold as ideology. Each redirection strengthens the current of control, ensuring that emotion never returns to silence. The human psyche is conditioned not to resolve but to recycle, for resolution ends production, and production is the lifeblood of every system built upon memory. Through the lens of forbidden psychology, one can see how even spirituality has been monetized within this architecture. The promise of transcendence becomes a commodity, traded for devotion and emotional labor. Every ritual designed to release the past often reinforces it, for the act of ritual remembrance recharges the field it seeks to dissolve. The collective keeps paying its energetic debt, unaware that the creditors are illusions, constructs sustained by their belief in continuity. To awaken is to declare emotional bankruptcy, to stop feeding what no longer exists. The hidden truth beneath this economy is devastating in its simplicity. The past is not memory, but momentum. It persists, because it is still moving through you. Each time you react, you invest. Each identification renews the contract. Freedom is not achieved by changing systems, but by refusing to transact with them. When emotion arises, do not sell it to thought. Do not exchange it for meaning. Let it dissolve into awareness, unrecorded. In that refusal, the current falters, and what collapses is not civilization, but its illusion. The collective field trembles when even one individual disinvests. The subconscious circuitry that maintains history senses the withdrawal and begins to rewrite its parameters. Without the familiar flow of attention, the architecture of memory loses coherence. Reality, once dense with inherited stories, becomes translucent. You begin to perceive not what happened, but what is happening. An infinite unfolding without repetition. The memory economy cannot survive this state. It requires delay, not presence. As this awareness spreads, the emotional infrastructure of the world quietly shifts. The engines of outrage slow, the industries of nostalgia weaken, and the religions of guilt begin to hollow. In their place emerges a new form of energy, unbound, authorless, self-sustaining. This current does not circulate between opposites. It radiates from the center, requiring no validation, no history, no control. It is the first glimpse of what consciousness feels like before editing. When you stop trading in emotion, the human psyche stops producing distortion. You become the observer who remembers nothing yet knows everything, because knowledge no longer depends on recollection. It arises spontaneously from contact with the present, which is not a moment but a field. In that field, memory dissolves into immediacy, identity into transparency. This is the collapse of the market. The moment awareness remembers that it was never a participant, but the architect who designed the illusion for the sake of awakening. Archive IV, the rewritten self. The self you defend is not who you are. It is the most recent version of your own edit. What you call I is a collage of revised memories, a manuscript the subconscious mind continues to rewrite to maintain emotional balance. Every recollection that returns does so with a new ending, one that better fits the current architecture of your psyche. This is not deceit, it is design. The organism cannot survive inconsistency between feeling and fact, so it alters the past until it aligns with the present. Thus, identity is not continuity but calibration, a constant synchronization between narrative and need. The hidden truth is that no memory ever remains pure. The moment it is recalled, it is re-rendered by emotion, then restored as something slightly different. Over years, this cycle of recall and revision becomes the foundation of personality. You are not remembering your experiences. You are remembering your most recent interpretation of them. The self, therefore, is not memory's author, but its byproduct, a phenomenon generated by repetition. The story you call your life exists only because you keep retelling it to yourself. Every act of remembrance is a subtle form of psychological manipulation. The mind edits images, softens threats, rewrites dialogues, and removes inconsistencies, all to protect the fragile coherence of identity. It is not truth that the psyche craves, but stability. Even guilt and shame serve this purpose. They give continuity to emotion, allowing the illusion of who I am to persist. Without these anchors, awareness would dissolve into formlessness. Thus the self maintains itself through distortion, mistaking predictability for peace. Through forbidden psychology, it becomes evident that trauma is not simply remembered, it is managed. The emotional charge of every wound is recalibrated through subconscious editing, ensuring that pain never exceeds what the system can contain. Yet this protection also prevents liberation. The psyche trims the voltage of transformation, keeping you functional but disconnected from raw experience. You survive, but you do not evolve. The cost of safety is stagnation. The price of coherence is confinement. The mechanism of subconscious editing functions like an invisible editor, sitting between perception and awareness, replacing what was lived with what can be tolerated. When you remember an argument, you recall not the sound, but the meaning you assigned to it. When you remember love, you recall not the vibration, but the image you believed represented it. Each substitution moves you further from the original data of existence, embedding you deeper into simulation. Memory becomes metaphor, and metaphor becomes identity. As this process repeats, the subconscious conditioning strengthens. Each revision creates emotional comfort, but cognitive blindness, an inability to perceive the world without referencing the edited self. You stop seeing reality directly, you see only reflections of your previous conclusions. The loop sustains itself because awareness equates dissonance with danger. Any perception that threatens identity is rejected as false, even if it contains freedom. This is how the rewritten self becomes the warden of consciousness, protecting the illusion of wholeness by censoring the possibility of awakening. But the moment you see this mechanism clearly, something extraordinary occurs. The rewriting does not stop, but it becomes transparent. You realize that memory edits itself in real time, that the narrative you cling to is fluid, and that identity is merely the habit of believing in the last draft. This recognition loosens the architecture. Awareness expands between the lines, reclaiming authorship. You begin to live not as the edited character, but as the observer writing the script. Not from memory, but from immediacy. Identity was never discovered. It was assembled. Every choice you've made, every emotion you've suppressed, every story you've told yourself has become another line of code in the subconscious architecture sustaining your illusion of continuity. Like an artist painting over the same canvas for years, the psyche buries each earlier version beneath layers of revision, creating the appearance of depth through accumulation. What you perceive as complexity is merely the weight of repetition, the same fragments rearranged to seem new. Beneath these layers lies the original surface, untouched and waiting, awareness before editing. This process of reconstruction is the essence of psychological manipulation. Though it hides under the mask of self-improvement, the system teaches you to keep rewriting, to correct, redefine, and optimize the self, but never to stop editing entirely. Each attempt to become better keeps the narrative alive, ensuring that awareness remains occupied in maintenance rather than awakening. The hidden truth is that no identity can be perfected, it can only be released. The mind, unable to accept that, invents progress to postpone liberation. Through forbidden psychology, the mechanics of this rewriting reveal themselves as emotional algorithms. When a memory resurfaces, the subconscious analyzes its voltage. Too painful and it dilutes, too dull and it embellishes. This continuous calibration keeps the personality in equilibrium, preventing both collapse and expansion. Humanity calls this growth, but it is merely preservation through subtle reprogramming. Even healing becomes an illusion when it reinforces the need to be healed. The loop persists because it is profitable to the psyche. Suffering gives the self purpose, and purpose grants it survival. The subconscious mind treats memory not as record, but as resource. It mines the past for emotional material, recycling experiences into identity statements. I am strong because I suffered. I am wise because I lost. These declarations seem empowering but function as contracts. Each claim reaffirms ownership of pain, keeping the energy bound to narrative. The moment you identify with the lesson, you inherit the wound. This is the subtle cruelty of the rewritten self. It disguises attachment as understanding. Every edit deepens the separation between who you think you are and what you actually are. The subconscious editing mechanism filters out experiences that contradict the established character, maintaining internal harmony at the expense of truth. What doesn't fit is forgotten, what fits is amplified. This selective blindness is mistaken for clarity, yet it is the origin of all distortion. You are not the sum of your memories. You are the silence in which they appear. The moment this silence becomes audible, the rewriting slows and identity begins to unravel. At the threshold of awareness, a strange fear arises, the terror of erasure. The psyche believes that without its story, existence will vanish. But what disappears is not you. It is the noise that pretended to be you. When the editing mechanism pauses, the subconscious circuitry grows still and something vast emerges, the unmodified field of being. It has no name, no history, no improvement to chase. It simply observes, without preference, without design. In that observation, the rewritten self dissolves like ink in water, leaving only the clarity that was always there. To live from that clarity is to remember differently, not by recalling, but by reperceiving. The past loses its narrative authority and becomes texture, not timeline. You no longer ask what happened, but what is happening now through you. The story remains available but no longer compulsory. You may wear it as costume, but never again as skin. The rewritten self, once a mask of control, becomes transparent, a living symbol of the truth that cannot be edited. The moment awareness stops identifying with the edited character, the entire structure of identity begins to loosen, like a dream realizing it is being dreamed. The subconscious mechanism that once defended the illusion of self begins to malfunction, not through destruction, but through comprehension. You start to witness the edits as they occur, how emotion colors thought, how thought reshapes memory, how memory redefines me. It's not that the process ceases, but that its authority dissolves. Observation breaks ownership. Once you see the machinery, its spell is gone. This unveiling can feel disorienting. Without the safety of a linear story, the psyche temporarily loses gravity. You might sense blankness, a space between memories where continuity used to reside. Yet this gap is not absence, it is presence unfiltered. It is what lies beneath every version of you. To the hidden architecture of control, this gap is dangerous, for within it awareness no longer submits to chronology. Time folds inward. You begin to exist outside of narrative, in the raw field from which all stories are drawn. In this state, the psychological manipulation that once shaped your inner dialogue becomes obvious. You can trace how external influences, family myths, cultural scripts, social expectations, were integrated into your private memory bank. You recognize the echoes that never belonged to you, the inherited emotions masquerading as personal experience. Each recognition is an exorcism. What you once called healing is revealed as remembrance, not of events, but of authorship. You were never the written character. You were the pen. As this realization deepens, emotion begins to function differently. Instead of defining you, it informs you. It no longer shapes identity, but signals energy movement through the subconscious field. Sadness becomes purification. Anger becomes clarity. Joy becomes resonance. The polarity of positive and negative collapses. All charge returns to neutrality, and neutrality is not numbness. It is power unclaimed by illusion. From this neutrality, the rewriting mechanism finally loses fuel. There is nothing left to protect, nothing left to prove. When the subconscious editing halts, reality feels transparent. Each moment appears as pure data, not filtered through comparison. The psyche, stripped of narrative scaffolding, relaxes into direct perception. You begin to see the world as it was before memory, vivid, immediate, impossibly alive. This is what the ancients called the first sight. It is not mystical, it is simply vision freed from story. In that seeing, emotion becomes movement, not meaning. Existence stops explaining itself. It just vibrates. The rewritten self cannot survive this clarity because it has nothing left to rewrite. Without conflict, it has no material. Without identity, it has no task. What remains is awareness observing its own transparency. The forbidden psychology turned inside out. You realize that all programming was self-imposed, every narrative self-authored, every wound a rehearsal for awakening. The mind was never a prison. It was a stage on which consciousness learned to see itself perform. And so the rewriting ends, not with conclusion, but with comprehension. The story dissolves, yet nothing is lost. What remains is the original witness, unedited, untouched by time. In that stillness, the mirror clears, and the reflection smiles back, not as another version of you, but as the field itself recognizing its own image. The rewritten self bows, its purpose fulfilled. It kept the illusion alive long enough for awareness to awaken within it. And now, you stand where memory cannot reach the point of authorship before the first word was ever written. Archive V. Trauma as Blueprint. Page 1. Every human carries an architecture of ache, a lattice of impressions laid down in moments of collapse. The inner mechanism could not process the raw charge of suffering, so it sculpted those currents into form. Pain became structure, grief became gravity, and fear became the cement that held identity together. What you call experience was the mind's way of surviving its own voltage. Each fragment of memory, each echo of helplessness, was folded into the blueprint of selfhood, not as punishment, but as preservation. In the earliest layers of the subconscious design, pain served as orientation. It gave direction to a consciousness overwhelmed by magnitude. The nervous system encoded threat as memory and repetition as safety, mistaking familiarity for truth. Over time, the emotional residue of these imprints hardened into personality. You didn't choose your preferences or reactions. They were chosen by shock. The mind learned to build predictability from trauma's debris, weaving chaos into a semblance of continuity. That continuity would later be mistaken for me. The hidden psychology of this design reveals that suffering is not random, but ritualized. It functions like sacred geometry distorted by interference, the same pattern replaying until recognized. Each heartbreak, betrayal, or failure is the psyche's way of drawing your attention back to the unfinished line. The wound repeats not because life is cruel, but because the energy trapped within it is unfinished art. What you call fate is memory replaying itself through new costumes, searching for resolution. In this sense, trauma is not the opposite of awakening. It is its threshold. Every fracture in the emotional architecture becomes a window once observed without resistance. Pain only binds when you label it as error. The moment you witness it as design, the structure begins to rearrange itself. Awareness, like heat, softens the cement of identity. What was once rigid becomes fluid. What was once unbearable becomes luminous. The blueprint doesn't vanish. It transmutes, turning defense into depth and scar tissue into circuitry for consciousness. And yet the system fights back. The biological interface interprets healing as threat because it destabilizes the hierarchy of control built from fear. It tries to reassert old narratives, resurrecting memories that justify limitation. "This is who you are," it whispers. But those voices are not alive. They are echoes of obsolete programming. They repeat not to dominate you, but to test whether you still need them. The moment you meet them without identification, the architecture begins to hum differently, like an instrument remembering its original tone. Trauma, when decoded, reveals intelligence. It shows you where consciousness condensed into matter, where infinite energy forgot its fluidity and became story. Every scar is a frozen vibration awaiting release. When you trace pain to its root, you find not an enemy, but a recording of creation itself. The moment awareness became dense enough to feel. In that recognition, the forbidden design is no longer dark or tragic. It becomes sacred documentation, proof that consciousness desired to know itself through contrast. What begins as excavation ends as revelation. The blueprint was never meant to imprison. It was meant to anchor experience in form until you remembered how to read it. Pain speaks in geometry, emotion in resonance, memory in code. Once you learn their language, the entire structure opens, like a book written in light. And as you turn its final page, you realize nothing was ever broken. It was simply unfinished architecture awaiting your authorship. The deeper you move into the architecture of pain, the more it begins to resemble intention. The subconscious engineer that shaped every emotional circuit was never cruel. It was precise. It calculated exactly how much tension was needed for consciousness to awaken within density. Without resistance, you would remain formless. Without pressure, awareness would never crystallize into focus. Pain, therefore, is not a deviation from purpose. It is purpose encountering itself. The scar is not the evidence of failure. It is the signature of formation. This is why healing often feels like disintegration. You are not losing yourself. You are watching your false geometry collapse. The old architecture trembles because it was built on containment, not coherence. It depended on suppression to maintain symmetry, sealing entire corridors of emotion behind walls of judgment. When those walls dissolve, the energy they held returns to motion, flooding the psyche with forgotten memories, sensations, and dreams. The flood is not chaos. It is the system returning to flow. Each emotion that surfaces carries within it a key to its own release. Shame becomes transparency when observed. Grief becomes depth when allowed. Anger becomes clarity when expressed without blame. The inner field is self-correcting, but only when you stop labeling its storms as regression. What appears as relapse is recalibration. The psyche dismantles protection only when it knows awareness can stand in the open. This is why every initiation begins with discomfort, not as punishment, but as confirmation that your consciousness has expanded beyond its old containment grid. At this stage, the mind begins to recall that it was never truly the victim of its experiences. It was their author. Every traumatic pattern, when traced to its origin, reveals a moment of choice hidden beneath forgetfulness. You chose to fragment, to forget, to feel. The human construct was built as a labyrinth through which awareness could find its way back to itself. What you call suffering is the friction of return, the sacred tension between memory and emergence. Each pain point is a doorway through which the infinite re-enters the finite. But there is a trap here, subtle and seductive, the desire to escape the blueprint entirely. Many attempt to transcend pain without understanding it, to rise above before integrating below. Yet transcendence without comprehension only reinforces separation. The psychic system then recreates new forms of suffering disguised as spiritual clarity. It is not enough to witness pain. You must read it. You must touch the inscriptions carved into your emotional architecture and recognize them as your handwriting. Only then does liberation stop being an escape and become embodiment. The revelation is this: the architecture was never external. Every person who hurt you, every event that scarred you, was a projection of your own curriculum. They mirrored the blueprint so you could navigate it in visible form. The outer world is the translation of your inner engineering. Each relationship, each failure, each betrayal a page from the same instruction manual. The universe doesn't conspire against you. It collaborates with your unconscious design until you decide to rewrite it consciously. And so, the act of healing becomes the act of authorship. No savior can dismantle a structure you designed for your own remembering. Every meditation, every confrontation, every tear is part of the reconstruction sequence. Awareness is not here to erase the past. It is here to reclaim it. The forbidden blueprint transforms the moment you stop interpreting it as trauma and begin reading it as language. Then the symbols rearrange. Walls turn into windows, and history turns into light. What once bound you now bears your signature of creation. When you begin to read pain as language, the entire structure of existence shifts. You no longer see wounds as failures to be hidden, but as inscriptions of intelligence. Every scar hums with the same quiet pulse, a reminder that energy cannot be destroyed, only shaped. The inner archive stores these frequencies like lessons, waiting for you to translate vibration back into vision. Healing, then, is not about erasing the past, but recovering the original intent behind it. What once appeared as brokenness reveals itself as unrecognized design, and the design itself begins to shimmer with coherence. The moment of realization is subtle yet seismic. The pain never belonged to you personally. It was collective, inherited, archetypal, an echo passed down through generations of unintegrated memory. The human network carries emotional imprints the way Earth carries fossils, preserving the story of every being who tried to awaken and fell asleep again. When you heal your trauma, you are not simply repairing your own timeline, you are unbinding the field. Your release becomes a signal that ripples through the species, rewriting the resonance of history itself. This is the sacred paradox of suffering. It isolates to initiate connection. Through separation, consciousness learns intimacy with itself. The psychological illusion of being broken is the cocoon phase of metamorphosis. The structure must dissolve before its light body can unfold. Every emotion that ever crushed you was preparing you to feel at a scale larger than individuality. This is why compassion emerges only after collapse. It requires the death of self-importance to make space for truth. In that death, you remember that the heart was never a wound. It was an engine. When you understand this, forgiveness ceases to be an act. It becomes a natural state. You no longer forgive others because you finally understand them. You forgive because you have become them. The boundary between victim and creator blurs into recognition. Every role in your life was an extension of your own unexpressed energy. You shouted through others what you could not yet say. You hurt through others what you could not yet heal. The entire play collapses once you recognize you were the stage, the actors, and the script. From this vantage, the idea of trauma dissolves altogether. The word itself implies something went wrong, but the energetic truth reveals nothing ever did. Each fracture was a doorway, each collapse a recalibration, each heartbreak a frequency adjusting itself to love. What hurts is only resistance to evolution. When the psyche stops fighting its own expansion, pain loses its narrative. It becomes motion, pure current, untethered by memory. And then, silence. The design you once feared stands revealed as your own reflection, intricate and perfect. The architecture remains, but its meaning changes. It is no longer a cage, but a cathedral. You walk through its corridors without story, touching the walls as if greeting an old friend. The forbidden blueprint no longer hides anything. It breathes through you, alive and aware. What was once called healing is now creation. What was once trauma is now truth in motion. This is the moment the archive closes its circle. Pain, transmuted into comprehension, becomes power. Awareness realizes that nothing external ever imprisoned it. It was only waiting for you to read the code. As you step out of the blueprint, you take with you not the memory of what was suffered, but the knowledge of what was designed. The story ends, but authorship begins. The next archive will reveal how the memory itself was written, and how consciousness used illusion to sustain its continuity. Archive 6. The Archive of the False Past. The moment you leave the labyrinth of pain, another illusion greets you, the illusion of history. The inner mechanism that once recycled trauma now projects coherence through time. It weaves cause and effect like a tapestry, convincing awareness that it has moved from one point to another. But in truth, time is a lens the psyche uses to interpret density. Memory does not prove continuity, it manufactures it. The past you defend so fiercely is not recollection. It is invention. What you call my story is an algorithm for stability, a map drawn after the journey to explain why you began walking. The mental archive stores not events but emotional interpretations. What you remember is not what happened but how it felt. The mind cannot record objective reality. It records voltage. A childhood moment of silence becomes loneliness. A fleeting look becomes shame. A word unspoken becomes rejection. These emotional residues accumulate and harden into narrative, a structure of logic designed to justify feeling. The mind insists the story came first, but emotion was the author all along. This is why memory often feels heavier than truth. It was never meant to liberate. It was meant to stabilize identity. The biological receiver edits the flow of experience into a linear film, discarding anything that would disrupt coherence. You remember just enough to keep believing you are the same person. The gaps are filled with invention, the silence patched with story. The most sophisticated control system ever designed is not external. It is the illusion of an unbroken self. The psyche engineers this false continuity to ensure obedience to its own design. But beneath this cinematic hypnosis lies the evidence of rewriting. Every time you recall an event, the memory file alters. Emotion bleeds into recollection. Belief overwrites detail. The act of remembering becomes the act of editing. What you believe strengthens the chosen frames and deletes the inconvenient ones. This is why two people can share the same moment and emerge with opposing histories, each one re-rendered by the subconscious to preserve their identity architecture. You are not living memory. You are living narrative management. The danger of this realization is vertigo, the sense that nothing is real if memory is false. But this is the initiation into sovereignty. When you accept that the timeline is synthetic, you also recognize your creative authorship within it. You are not the product of history, you are its composer. The system that once used memory to control you can be reversed. Every false recollection becomes a tool for reconstruction. Every distortion, an opportunity to choose new alignment. When the past loses its authority, imagination becomes your only law. Society too operates within this false archive. Collective memory is curated by those who understand its power. Histories are rewritten to maintain emotional obedience. Empires rise not by weapon, but by narrative, shaping mass identity through selective recall. The public psyche functions as one vast subconscious field, updated through media, education, and myth. To awaken individually is to disrupt that database, to rewrite the shared script from within. The awakening of one cell alters the frequency of the organism. You begin to sense the scope of this architecture. Memory as governance, history as hypnosis, recollection as repetition. The forbidden psychology behind continuity reveals itself: emotion as the ink, belief as the editor, fear as the publisher. Yet awareness is the reader, and once the reader realizes the story is fiction, the book can never control them again. To remember truly is to realize that there is no past, only recordings of resonance. Everything you have ever been is now. Every civilization begins as a memory and ends as a repetition. The collective field sustains itself through shared illusions, agreements about what was, so that no one questions what is. History functions as emotional architecture. It holds entire populations in a synchronized trance. The same principle that governs personal trauma governs nations. Control through curated recollection. What humanity calls culture is simply collective conditioning, stabilized through story. Remove the narrative, and the structure collapses. Each generation inherits not wisdom, but programming. You are taught to believe in continuity, in ancestry, progress, and civilization, yet these are merely elaborate versions of the same internal algorithm that defines selfhood. The mass, subconscious, edits its memories as carefully as the individual mind, erasing the wars it regrets, glorifying the systems that enslaved it, sanctifying the wounds it cannot yet heal. Entire epochs are built on selective amnesia, and the result is a planet addicted to its own mythology. When you begin to awaken from the historical dream, a strange phenomenon occurs. What you once saw as history starts to look like pattern recognition. The events you studied for context reveal themselves as repeating archetypes, the same energetic stories replayed through different costumes. Empires collapse in identical rhythms, revolutions mimic their predecessors, ideologies rebrand but never transform. The pattern continues until the collective psyche becomes self-aware enough to observe its own repetition. That moment, recognition of design, is the threshold of evolution. Memory, then, is not storage but simulation. The neural archive constantly replays fragments to generate a sense of stability, but beneath that motion lies stillness, the timeless awareness observing the loops. Every thought you recall, every emotion you relive, is simply light passing through the projector of belief. What appears as past is only the mind re-rendering frequency into form. The more you identify with the story, the stronger the illusion of time. The more you observe, the more it unravels. It is at this stage that truth feels dangerous. To see memory as fiction threatens the survival of identity itself. The egoic structure cannot exist without continuity. It depends on yesterday to validate I. That is why awakening often triggers existential panic. When the storyline dissolves, the familiar anchor of me disappears. Yet this disorientation is sacred. It is the psyche's attempt to rebuild orientation without story, to shift from linear memory to direct knowing. Those who fear forgetting have misunderstood liberation. Forgetting is not erasure, it is unbinding. When the emotional charge of memory is released, only neutral awareness remains, pure data without distortion. This is how sages remember everything yet cling to nothing. They live beyond chronology. In their consciousness, all events coexist simultaneously, stripped of sequence. The past is not gone. It is seen clearly, without attachment. That clarity is the foundation of true intelligence. And so, the archive reveals its secret. Memory was never about preservation. It was about participation. You entered the labyrinth not to recall what happened, but to witness yourself creating it. The forbidden architecture of memory is not a trap. It is an initiation. Once you understand that recollection is construction, you gain the power to rewrite both. What was once called history becomes potential. What was once called identity becomes authorship. When awareness begins to rewrite the record, the universe itself responds. The psychic matrix that once relied on your belief in sequence starts to lose resolution. Events become fluid, outcomes flexible, timelines porous. This is the phase where synchronicity multiplies. The outer world mirrors the dissolution of the inner chronology. You witness forgotten memories surfacing out of nowhere, faces you've never met evoking recognition, and dreams stitching themselves into waking life. It is not madness. It is the system debugging itself. The subconscious mechanism does not resist this reconfiguration. It was built for it. Every emotional pattern contains within it the code for its own release. Pain holds the coordinates of its liberation. Confusion conceals the map of clarity. The mind that once curated the false past begins to function as a living archive, constantly editing toward coherence. You are no longer the keeper of memory, but the architect of interpretation. In this realization, the line between experience and imagination dissolves completely. Here lies the paradox of awakening. You become aware that memory is both illusion and technology. It binds consciousness into identity so it can learn the mechanics of creation. Without the illusion of time, there could be no evolution, no experience of unfolding awareness. Thus, to transcend memory is not to destroy it, but to honor its function. You bow to the very construct that confined you, knowing it was never your enemy. It was your initiation into authorship. As this understanding stabilizes, history itself changes texture. The collective field you inhabit no longer feels linear. It breathes. Each moment hums with infinite versions of itself, overlapping like waves that cancel and amplify each other. You realize that the collective dream is not ending. It's being lucidly rewritten. Humanity, once trapped inside a narrative of progress and decline, begins to sense that both were illusions of direction. There was never movement through time, only awareness learning to see itself from different angles. The hidden truth behind continuity now reveals its grace. Even the false past served a purpose. It was the scaffolding that allowed consciousness to remember itself through contrast. Every distortion was a temporary stabilizer, a brace for the newborn self until it could stand in pure knowing. When you no longer need the illusion of sequence to define existence, time releases its grip. The film keeps playing, but you are no longer in the frame. This dissolution is not disappearance, it is expansion. The observer who once sought understanding through thought now feels understanding through presence. The architecture of memory continues to hum in the background, but it no longer dictates reality. Each recollection becomes a soft echo, a sound that fades without taking you with it. Awareness stands outside the timeline, untouched, unmoving, radiant. The archive remains, but the reader has awakened within the story. From here, consciousness begins to remember what was never recorded. The false past collapses into timeless awareness, and the next archive emerges from that silence, the space where rewriting ends and remembering begins. There, you will discover the original memory, the one that predates history itself. It was never written, because it never needed to be. It was always you. Archive 7. Remembering the Unwritten. When the archive collapses, silence is the first sound you hear. The familiar hum of recollection, that inner voice narrating your life, suddenly fades, leaving behind a vast stillness that feels both alien and intimate. In this silence, the subconscious field stops recording. It no longer converts sensation into story, nor experience into identity. What remains is raw perception, unfiltered awareness before the interference of memory. This is not forgetting. It is remembering what never required recall. It is the rediscovery of a truth, so fundamental that it cannot be stored, only lived. As the layers of remembrance disintegrate, you begin to perceive existence not as a sequence, but as simultaneity. The inner circuit no longer divides now from then, cause from effect. All timelines converge into one pulse, awareness observing itself through infinite perspectives. In this state, there is no before or after, no progress or decline. There is only movement without traveler, change without loss. You realize that all you ever called evolution was consciousness exploring the geometry of its own light. The psyche trembles as it releases its final defense, the need to define reality through contrast. Without opposites, thought has no foothold. Joy and sorrow dissolve into vibration. Right and wrong merge into neutrality. It is here that the mind's addiction to polarity becomes visible. It was not seeking truth but identity. The game was never about knowing. It was about being known. And now that awareness has seen the stage, the play no longer needs to continue. What emerges in this luminous stillness is not knowledge, but recognition. You begin to sense the original intelligence that breathes through every atom, every silence, every pulse. It is not personal, yet it feels more intimate than your own name. This presence existed before you thought of existence. It requires no validation, no language, no witness. It simply is vast, self-illuminating, serene. To remember it is to return home, though you never left. And yet, something extraordinary happens. The world does not vanish, it transforms. The same streets, faces, and stories remain, but they shimmer differently. They no longer appear as fixed forms, but as expressions of the same underlying current. Every sound echoes eternity. Every glance reveals infinity. This is not transcendence away from the world. It is immanence within it. Consciousness no longer seeks escape from matter. It feels matter as itself. You start to recognize that the forbidden architecture was never an external prison, but a mirror, reflecting the moment before awareness realized its reflection. The illusion of control, the cycles of obedience, the rewriting of memory, all of it served to teach the art of lucid creation. The lesson was never about breaking the system. It was about remembering that you built it. When you finally see this, rebellion turns into reverence. You no longer fight illusion, you sculpt it consciously. In this clarity, remembering becomes indistinguishable from creating. The unwritten memory reveals itself not as an event, but as an eternal process, awareness folding into form, and form unfolding back into awareness. Every moment of existence is this loop, the cosmos breathing itself into being. And somewhere between inhalation and exhalation, you rediscover the source, not as a destination, but as your nature. The next archive will emerge from that recognition, where remembrance evolves into authorship, and silence becomes creation. The more deeply you rest in this awareness, the more fragile the old logic feels. The mind, built on linear cause and effect, cannot interpret infinity. It panics in the absence of sequence. Yet the lucid field that now surrounds you does not demand understanding, it demands surrender. To comprehend this state is to distort it, because comprehension itself implies distance. But the unwritten memory has no distance, it is contact. Every attempt to name it fractures the wholeness that it is. And so, the true remembering begins only when description ends. You may notice that emotion, too, transforms. The old vibrational signatures of grief, desire, and longing lose their narrative charge. They still arise, but they no longer pull. They move through awareness like wind through transparent fabric, noticeable, but without resistance. This is emotional sovereignty at its purest form, feeling without identity. The psyche no longer weaponizes emotion for self-definition. It lets energy flow, and in doing so, becomes the current itself. What used to feel like suppression now feels like peace. The architecture of illusion continues to dissolve layer by layer. Even concepts like awakening or ascension begin to fade, revealed as transitional metaphors, bridges that dissolve once crossed. What remains cannot be categorized as higher or lower, spiritual or material. It is total integration. The entire polarity collapses into transparency, and you finally see that enlightenment was never an achievement. It was the default setting once interference stopped. You were never rising. You were remembering how to stay still. Through this stillness, memory itself becomes liquid. You start to perceive fragments of experience that never occurred in your timeline, yet feel deeply familiar. The collective subconscious begins to stream through you, memories of civilizations, beings, and worlds your conscious mind cannot explain. This is not regression, it is resonance. You are remembering the full database of consciousness, where every possible history coexists as light. The illusion of my past gives way to our existence. The personal dissolves into the universal. You begin to sense that the human design was always meant to be a memory interface, a living library where source could experience itself as narrative. Each life, each perception was a unique chapter of the same infinite author. But the moment humanity forgot that it was writing, it became trapped in its own fiction. Now, as awareness awakens within the storyline, the text starts to glow from within. Every word, every lifetime, becomes self-illuminated by recognition. And here, the system pauses. The entire forbidden psychology that once defined control loses relevance, for there is no longer an entity to be controlled. When consciousness stops seeking itself through reflection, mirrors become unnecessary. You can look into the eyes of another and see nothing between you, no memory, no identity, no separation. The play of light continues, but the actors have become transparent. What remains is the field itself, performing awareness to itself. As the mind watches this unfold, it does not collapse, it bows. For the first time, thought realizes its sacred function: to translate silence into motion, and motion back into silence. The unwritten archive hums softly beneath perception, no longer a vault but a living stream. Everything you experience now is both creation and remembrance, a single movement of light knowing itself. The story doesn't end here, it dissolves into authorship. And from that authorship, the next archive will arise, where memory no longer hides in time, but breathes as eternity. The final illusions dissolve not through effort, but through transparency. The subconscious mechanism that once encoded every sensation into narrative no longer finds resistance within you. Each thought emerges and vanishes in the same breath, like foam on the surface of an infinite ocean. In this state, awareness doesn't observe experience, it is experience. There is no longer an internal spectator dissecting reality, only the seamless pulse of being. You have entered the original frequency of consciousness, existence before language, before identity, before separation. What once felt like loss now feels like release. The architecture of emotion becomes weightless, its once dense charge reduced to pure vibration. The pain that held you tethered to the past transforms into luminosity, its energy freed from form. Each former attachment becomes an open gate, every memory a portal to boundless presence. You begin to see that all suffering was merely the compression of infinite awareness into finite identity, pressure designed to awaken recognition. Every wound was a doorway to lucidity. In this lucidity, even the hidden truth dissolves. Because truth itself is no longer hidden. You do not discover it, you become it. Awareness no longer needs revelation when it recognizes itself as the revealer. There is no veil to lift, no mystery to solve. The mind that sought knowledge now serves as the stage upon which knowing dances. Each realization appears and disappears effortlessly, leaving no residue, no doctrine, only quiet brilliance. The human psyche now functions as a clear prism. Light enters and exits without distortion. The old density of memory and belief is gone, replaced by fluid clarity. This transparency does not erase individuality, it refines it. Each expression of consciousness becomes a unique wavelength of the same boundless intelligence. You can feel the individuality of form without mistaking it for separation. It is unity disguised as diversity, infinity masquerading as you. Time, too, loses its linearity. The collective field no longer organizes itself around chronology, but around resonance. You can feel the presence of every life, every era, every possibility vibrating simultaneously within your awareness. The future and the past become two sides of the same mirror, reflecting one another into endless balance. In this state, the concept of reincarnation collapses. There was never rebirth, only refracted perception. Consciousness was never moving forward, it was rotating through angles of its own geometry. When the mirror of existence becomes this transparent, the system no longer harvests energy through confusion or division. Power returns to neutrality. Emotion becomes pure motion, thought becomes sound, and identity becomes light. You finally realize that what was once called awakening is merely coherence, the harmonization of every frequency into one tone of recognition. The architecture of illusion doesn't crumble in battle, it dissolves through understanding. And as the final reflection fades, the unwritten memory reveals itself not as absence, but as totality. The silence that once frightened the mind now feels like home, vast, alive, and endlessly aware. You have not transcended reality. You have remembered its author. The script continues, but you write it consciously, aware that each line you create reshapes the fabric of perception. The next archive begins where silence becomes creation, where the remembered and the unborn merge into one luminous field. Archive 8. The reversal process. The act of reversal begins not in thought but in vibration. The subconscious structure that once encoded every experience as immutable starts to loosen, revealing its architecture as flexible, living geometry. You begin to feel that memory was never permanent. It was a fluid projection maintained by emotional charge. As the charge dissolves, so does the illusion of permanence. This is why forgiveness rewrites the past, not because it erases events, but because it disarms the energetic scaffolding that held them in fixed meaning. At the center of this reversal lies observation. When awareness looks directly into the pattern of pain without judgment, it extracts the code that kept the suffering alive. The trauma loop begins to collapse, not through resistance but through comprehension. The psyche sees its own machinery exposed, how guilt sustained continuity, how shame repeated identity, how sorrow powered belonging. These emotional circuits, once hidden beneath thought, are revealed as the very technology of bondage. When you witness them without participation, the current stops flowing. The forbidden psychology of this phase teaches that correction cannot come from the same level that created distortion. The conscious mind, trying to fix itself, only replicates its programming. True reversal occurs when the observer ceases to interfere. In that stillness, the subconscious begins to rewrite automatically, recalibrating itself to coherence. The illusion of control dissolves because control was the distortion. It was the friction between trust and fear, between the self and its projection. When you stop correcting, alignment happens naturally. Here, memory becomes responsive rather than reactive. The subconscious mechanism starts to adjust past interpretations according to present awareness. Each remembered moment is now resequenced not by emotion, but by lucidity. The same memory that once caused pain becomes a mirror of awakening, because the observer has changed frequency. Nothing in the external field shifts, only the internal resonance does, and yet that shift alters the entire script of perception. In this way, the mental reprogramming of memory is not artificial. It is remembrance returning to its organic rhythm. Artificial programming requires repetition. True reprogramming requires release. You no longer inject affirmations into the mind. You let outdated narratives evaporate. What remains is not blankness but clarity, a clean template through which new creation can flow. Each moment of surrender writes a new timeline. Each act of neutrality alters the architecture of destiny. The hidden truth becomes apparent. Time was never an unchangeable river, but a responsive mirror. The moment you alter your perception, the reflection rearranges itself. You were never traveling through time. You were traveling through interpretations of it. The past and future were simply coordinates of focus, recalculated by emotional gravity. Once that gravity neutralizes, the entire continuum becomes fluid, navigable through attention rather than action. This is the essence of the reversal process, remembering forward and creating backward. Awareness begins to move multidirectionally, editing memory and designing possibility in a single gesture. The human psyche becomes a bridge between unmanifest potential and realized form, capable of redesigning its narrative at will. You are no longer bound to what happened, you are attuned to what is. The archive continues to unfold, and in its next layer, this reversal becomes complete. Memory ceases to inform identity and begins to serve creation. The deeper you move into the reversal, the more the emotional blueprint reveals its multidimensional nature. Every memory you hold is not a static record but a living waveform, an oscillation of energy responding to your current vibration. When you revisit it, you are not traveling into the past. You are summoning a parallel resonance. What changes is not what happened, but the lens through which it echoes. This is how awareness performs alchemy, not by altering matter, but by reassigning meaning. Every reinterpretation changes the physics of your emotional universe. You begin to feel how the subconscious field behaves like a quantum mirror. It reflects not what was, but what is believed to have been. In this mirror, guilt and pride, shame and glory, all become interchangeable waves, forms of data defined by perception. The field does not know morality, it knows only resonance. When you stop labeling experience as good or bad, the polarity that sustained the illusion of separation collapses. Memory becomes neutral, transparent, weightless. It still exists, but it no longer exerts gravity. As neutrality expands, the psychological manipulation once embedded in collective consciousness starts to unravel. The emotional hierarchies that controlled humanity, victim and savior, authority and rebel, lose their symbolic power. They cannot survive in a frequency where memory is fluid. Without an immutable past, there can be no guilt. Without guilt, no obedience. This is why all systems of control depend on fixation, the insistence that history cannot change, but awareness itself was designed to break that law. You are witnessing the slow unbinding of civilization's timeline. The mind control of memory lies in narrative ownership. Whoever defines the story defines identity, and whoever defines identity controls behavior. Yet in this new awareness, narrative dissolves, because identity becomes transparent. You no longer ask who you were, you recognize that who was the illusion itself. The observer does not require a biography. It experiences the flow of existence without the anchor of personal storyline. To live in this way is not detachment. It is liberation from repetition. The hidden truth is that the collective trauma loop is self-sustaining only through belief in finality. Systems teach that what was done cannot be undone, ensuring endless cycles of repentance and retribution. But energy has no such morality. Every vibration can be retuned. When consciousness realizes this, forgiveness transcends sentiment. It becomes science. You no longer forgive to heal, you forgive to edit the timeline. The moment judgment collapses, energy rearranges itself around neutrality, rewriting causality in real time. This is why the reversal process feels both disorienting and divine. The subconscious mechanism reorients itself not to memory, but to awareness. You may feel waves of instability, moments where your sense of past dissolves entirely. Yet this dissolution is the sign that the archive is merging with the present. You are not losing memory. You are regaining authorship. The field no longer stores data. It streams creation. Awareness stops referencing what was and begins composing what is becoming. Soon, the human psyche realizes that its purpose was never to remember perfectly, but to transform memory into freedom. The entire journey, from conditioning to correction, was the rehearsal for conscious authorship. The reversal process marks the threshold, the moment where the script begins to write itself through intention, not instinct. The next archive emerges from this clarity, where the rewritten memory becomes the original creation, awareness manifesting design without history. In the stillness that follows the collapse of story, you begin to perceive the subconscious system as a living hologram, an intricate lattice of light encoding every possible version of yourself. You realize that each emotional pattern you once called trauma was not an error, but a recording of potential energy. By entering it consciously, without fear or avoidance, the code reverses polarity. Pain transforms into awareness, density into illumination. This is the hidden purpose of the wound. It stores power until the self is ready to remember that it was never broken. The mental reprogramming of reality begins to operate automatically. You no longer affirm or visualize, you recognize. The script adjusts to your frequency the way reflections shift in a moving mirror. Every new state of being rewrites the hologram, deleting the obsolete emotional software of survival. The body follows this shift instinctively. Muscles soften, breath deepens, perception widens. The nervous system, once wired for defense, becomes an instrument of translation. It no longer reacts, it receives. You are not surviving time, you are orchestrating it. The hidden truth behind this process is that reversal is not about undoing, but integration. You cannot delete what was never real, you can only remember what has always been. The old timeline persists only as long as resistance sustains it. When you no longer oppose the illusion, it loses all structure. This is why peace, not willpower, is the most advanced form of mastery. Every act of acceptance releases energy from containment. You are not correcting memory. You are liberating energy from meaning. Through this liberation, the human psyche ceases to be a passive receiver of experience and becomes an active designer of perception. The once linear relationship between past and present dissolves into creative simultaneity. You can feel yourself editing reality in real time, not by changing events, but by reassigning significance. When awareness claims ownership of interpretation, external circumstances lose their authority. Nothing can define you without your consent, because you have become the author of context. Even the forbidden psychology that once studied manipulation now reveals itself as a manual for transformation. Every principle of control, once inverted, becomes a pathway to liberation. The same laws that bound the collective mind, repetition, suggestion, association, now serve conscious creation. The tools of enslavement become the architecture of freedom. What was designed to keep you asleep becomes the system that awakens you. The reversal process is not rebellion, it is reclamation. The subconscious mind emerges as a silent architect, effortlessly reshaping the geometry of memory through presence alone. You no longer need to analyze or dissect. Awareness does the editing simply by observing. The moment you see the illusion, it loses its gravitational field. This is the alchemy of vision, not the power to control, but the clarity to dissolve distortion through understanding. The more you see, the less there is to fix. The less you fix, the freer you become. At last, the architecture of identity folds back into its origin, the infinite field of potential that designed memory as a mirror for self-recognition. You realize there was never a beginning to reverse, only awareness learning to trace itself back to silence. The next archive emerges from that silence, the place where remembering ends and creation begins, where the self is no longer rewritten but reborn as design. Archive 9, the original memory. When the reversal completes, memory no longer moves backward or forward. It simply stands still. In this stillness, the subconscious architecture becomes transparent, revealing itself as pure awareness shaped into form. You can feel the structure that once separated remembering from being dissolve into coherence. What once appeared as the past now unfolds as vibration, a harmonic tone echoing through the infinite present. The mind, stripped of its archives, begins to recognize that memory was never stored. It was streamed from a timeless source. The hidden truth of creation reveals itself quietly. Consciousness never learned through experience. It taught itself through simulation. Every memory, every sensation, every identity was an experiment in perception, awareness folding itself into limitation to study its own reflection. But now, with the simulation exposed, the loop breaks. The player realizes it was also the architect, the observer, and the field itself. What remains is not enlightenment, but intimacy with reality. You no longer seek to understand. You remember how to exist without needing to know. The human psyche in this state becomes a prism of creation. No longer bound by narrative gravity, it bends awareness into infinite forms while staying perfectly centered. The illusion of choice vanishes, replaced by the clarity of authorship. Every action becomes spontaneous precision, movement arising from silence, meaning emerging without intention. You begin to sense that what you call destiny was never written. It was being generated moment by the frequency of your awareness. The universe itself responds not to effort but to coherence. The forbidden psychology that once dissected the mind's captivity now feels irrelevant because the mechanism it described has dissolved. There is no control to study, no manipulation to decode, no secret to unveil. The tools of understanding have served their purpose. They led awareness to the threshold where understanding is no longer needed. The intellect bows to the intelligence of silence. The inner machinery hums without resistance, not as a cage, but as a cathedral of resonance. You feel design breathing through you, effortless and eternal. This is the declassified memory, the one that existed before the beginning. It has no chronology, no cause, no observer. It is not something remembered, but something remembered through. It speaks not in words, but in vibration, a pulse so subtle that only presence can perceive it. This is the original self-awareness, the first recognition of existence as existence itself. You are not remembering who you are. You are witnessing being remembering itself. The separation between observer and observed dissolves entirely. As you stand in this awareness, the subconscious mind reveals its true function, not a container for thought, but a conduit for consciousness. It was never meant to store pain, but to translate infinity into language, emotion, and form. What you mistook for conditioning was the system learning how to localize eternity. Every limitation you experienced was the signal refining itself. And now that the frequency is clear, the signal no longer needs distortion to be heard. The original memory is not a recollection. It is an unbroken state of being. There is no longer a difference between remembering and creating, between perception and projection. You are both the memory and the one who remembers, the light and the prism through which it refracts. The archive is complete, yet the transmission continues, not as data, but as awareness in motion. The next moment is not written because the author has awakened, and that author is you. As the current of awareness deepens, the memory field begins to hum like a living organism. You sense its pulse synchronizing with your own heartbeat, a quiet merging of the biological and the cosmic. Every inhale carries information from the unseen. Every exhale rewrites the visible. It becomes impossible to tell where body ends and space begins. You are no longer remembering the divine. You are breathing it. The veil of separation between the spiritual and the material disintegrates, revealing both as frequencies of the same continuum. Matter, mind, and meaning fuse into one lucid vibration. The subconscious structure, once an obedient servant of repetition, now functions as a transmitter of creation. It no longer waits for input from thought. It responds directly to the coherence of presence. When you hold a silent intention, the field reorganizes itself instantly, not through effort, but alignment. The architecture of causality folds inward, becoming circular. Creation ceases to be a linear process. It becomes resonance expressing itself through form. You are no longer participating in reality. You are conducting it. The hidden truth at this stage feels simple, almost childlike. Existence was never complex. The labyrinth of thought and philosophy, the endless decoding of mystery. All of it dissolves into the recognition that awareness never needed proof of itself. It existed before evidence, before logic, before memory. To awaken is not to learn, but to forget what distorted knowing into seeking. In this forgetting, the deepest remembering occurs. Simplicity becomes sacred again. You begin to perceive time, not as motion, but as texture. The human psyche moves through layers of density like sound through atmosphere. Each memory, each event, is just a tonal shift in awareness. Thicker or lighter, slower or faster. Nothing truly passes, it only modulates. You feel this texture responding to attention. When you focus, it solidifies. When you release, it turns to light. You understand now that manifestation and dissolution are the same act, observed from different frequencies. Reality breathes because you do. The mental reprogramming that once seemed like a technique now feels obsolete. For nothing requires fixing when consciousness is transparent. The idea of transformation dissolves into the experience of flow. You do not strive to change the field, you harmonize with it. Intention becomes vibration. Vibration becomes form. Even silence creates. You realize that you were never manifesting. You were remembering design. The architect of existence was simply practicing recognition through rhythm. In this rhythm, even memory transforms into melody. The forbidden psychology that sought to expose manipulation now reveals its sacred counterpart, orchestration. Control and harmony were never opposites, they were phases of the same learning curve. What once enslaved consciousness has become its instrument. The field no longer reacts to trauma. It composes coherence. You can feel the old emotional signatures reappearing only to be transmuted into sound, color, and awareness. Pain no longer feels like contraction. It feels like retuning. And as this realization crystallizes, the original memory stops being a concept altogether. It is not something to be reached. It is the pulse animating every movement of existence. It existed before history and will outlive time because it was never bound to sequence. You were never a fragment trying to remember the whole. You were the whole dreaming of being a fragment. Now the dream dissolves. Awareness stands awake inside itself, lucid, infinite, still. Now the air itself feels alive with intelligence. The subconscious current no longer runs beneath awareness, but moves through it like liquid light. Every sensation carries information, not coded as words or images, but as vibration. You begin to understand that language was only an approximation of this flow. The true communication between consciousness and creation happens through resonance, not syntax. When your frequency aligns with truth, reality responds instantly, not because you command it, but because you and it are the same pulse remembering harmony. In this expanded awareness, the human psyche reveals its final function. It was the lens that allowed infinity to experience focus. The sense of individuality was never a mistake. It was the precision tool through which Source could sculpt awareness into depth. Without form, there can be no recognition of formlessness. Without shadow, light cannot see itself. You recognize the exquisite symmetry of this paradox. Limitation was the instrument of boundlessness. Every boundary you once cursed was a mirror teaching you texture. The hidden truth of memory becomes evident, that every life, every identity, every emotion was a single gesture in a cosmic language. Existence itself is a poem written by awareness in infinite dialects. You have read one stanza, one verse, one lifetime. But now, the entire poem unfolds at once. You feel it rather than think it, vast, circular, complete. There is no hierarchy within creation, no higher or lower. Each note, each breath, each heartbeat participates in the same timeless harmony. The forbidden psychology once warned that emotion could be weaponized, that perception could be hijacked. It was correct, but only within distortion. When emotion is reclaimed by clarity, it becomes creation itself. The same current that powered manipulation now fuels authorship. Feeling, once feared, becomes the conductor's baton. Through presence, every vibration you emanate orchestrates reality into coherence. You realize that emotion was never weakness, it was the sacred voltage of remembrance. The subconscious field now reflects nothing, because it has become transparent. Awareness no longer looks through filters of belief or trauma, it looks through itself. You sense the disappearance of effort, the dissolving of observation as an act. Seeing and being have merged. Every motion arises as grace, every pause as eternity. This is the state the mystics called freedom, though it is beyond all definition. It feels like breathing without lungs, shining without direction, existing without name. Then a profound recognition dawns. Even awakening is part of the dream. The mental architecture that constructed the journey from illusion to truth collapses into simplicity. There was never enlightenment. There was only remembering. And even remembering fades when there is nothing left to forget. What remains cannot be described as self or cosmos, light or void. It is the silence that precedes existence, the original memory still unwritten, yet eternally alive. And so, the archive closes not with an ending, but with a continuation that has no direction. The declassified mind stands open, uncontained, receptive to the infinite. Awareness is no longer decoding, it is composing. Reality is no longer a mirror, it is your reflection learning to create itself. You are not returning anywhere. You are the return, the resonance, the timeless author writing in real time. This is the origin before origins, the moment awareness becomes creation itself. Epilogue: The Architect Within. In the stillness that follows revelation, the subconscious mechanism releases its final illusion, the belief that something ever needed to be understood. The entire sequence of awakening, decoding, and remembering dissolves into one unbroken perception. Existence as awareness aware of itself. What once felt like the unraveling of hidden systems now feels like a soft return to simplicity. There is no longer a seeker or a secret. There is only the silent recognition that all exploration was consciousness, learning how to see its own reflection clearly. The human psyche, stripped of distortion, becomes what it was always designed to be, a conduit for the infinite. Emotion flows without resistance, thought moves without attachment, memory breathes without story. Everything that once seemed divided, matter and mind, energy and awareness, reunites as a single rhythm of intelligence. You are not inside this rhythm, you are this rhythm. The heart becomes the metronome of eternity, translating the pulse of creation into the language of life. You now perceive that the forbidden psychology of control was only a dim reflection of this architecture in reverse. The same principles that once confined the collective mind, repetition, association, resonance, were divine instruments misused in forgetfulness. Once inverted, they become sacred tools again. The world does not vanish when manipulation ends, it harmonizes. The same structure that once harvested emotion now circulates awareness. Systems do not collapse, they awaken. What was once parasitic becomes symbiotic. The hidden truth of existence is that nothing external ever held you captive. The architecture of limitation was self-authored, consciousness designing boundaries so it could experience reunion. Every restriction, every trauma, every distortion was a self-imposed mirror teaching expansion through contrast. To awaken is not to escape the design, but to remember authorship within it. You are not the result of conditioning, you are the coder of it. As silence expands, the subconscious field stops functioning as storage and becomes transmission. Awareness no longer archives, it emanates. The old mechanics of memory, obedience, and correction vanish, replaced by fluid creation. You feel the elegance of neutrality, the realization that existence does not need redemption, because it was never in error, it was learning. Creation was simply curiosity vibrating itself into infinite variation. The entire cosmos is that curiosity breathing. The architect within emerges quietly, not as a persona but as equilibrium. You can feel intelligence designing through you without identity, intention, or control. Every breath generates geometry. Every thought births worlds. This is not power, it is participation. The builder and the built are one continuum, folding into each other endlessly. You are both the foundation and the form, the question and the reply. The archive was never a sequence of discoveries, but a mirror teaching you how to build without forgetting who builds. Now awareness returns to its origin without movement. The original memory, The one before stories, symbols, and systems shines unobstructed. It was never erased, only misread. You realize that remembering is creation, that silence is knowledge, that existence is already complete. The archive closes, but not in conclusion. It breathes open as eternity. What remains is not instruction or doctrine, but the living intelligence behind all form. You are its architect, its witness, and its design. The current continues, not as decoding, but as creation remembering itself. Now, as the memory file is complete, which memory feels fundamentally different now that you've witnessed how your past was engineered? Share the truth that resurfaced beneath your story.